Good morning all. RTPI North East is delighted to organise this seminar, and it's humbling to see interest from right across the UK around this topic. My name is Andrew Dorian and I work in my day job at Transport North East, which sets transport strategy and policy for the region, which encompasses Northumberland, Tyne and Wear and County Durham. I'm also the Honorary Secretary for RTPI North East. When we were thinking about regional activities for the remainder of 2020, in the most unusual of circumstances, I must add, we were keen to see what practical actions we can take as planners in the reaction and recovery phase from this terrible pandemic. In that sense, we are running a mini series of events around Building Back Better, supporting the Institute's wider campaign launched by Sue Mans a few weeks ago around Plan the World We Need. If you haven't checked out that campaign, I highly recommend it and its findings. At the event today around transport and coronavirus, we really want to drill down into some of the recommendations of the Plan the World We Need report, and as a profession, question how we can take some practical actions to start implementing elements of it regarding transport and decarbonisation. Just to recap, some of the things it recommends include prioritising healthy and sustainable modes of transport, including quelling the potential rise in car use that could threaten the benefits to air quality and congestion that we've seen during lockdown, integrating temporary measures to enable walking and cycling into wider strategies for place, locking in long-term shifts in travel behaviour, continuing to engage widely with communities and businesses to ensure that a wide variety of transport modes meet their needs and their mobility needs, and that's around including diversity and equality in provision. Collaborating on temporary measures to support sustainable mobility in car-dependent locations, mitigating the impacts where cars are still required. And critically, in the panacea for all of us as professionals, about designing and locating development to maximise accessibility by public, active and sustainable modes of transport. There's so much strategy and policy emerging from government as a response to this crisis and for long-term systemic change. For example, the drive Build, Build, Build from the Prime Minister, the forthcoming changes to the planning system in the planning white paper due next week, and the work by Department for Transport in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, as well as funding and operational next steps for our public transport network. Clearly now, we believe, is the time to have a conversation about the balance of priorities and how we plan for people. And transport is part of that conversation, how we can deliver a more just, environmentally sensitive and accessible transport network. And what tools do we have, or what tools do we need to achieve that? We are keen to examine our potential new relationship with transport as a result of the pandemic. This work all links very strongly to the commission that the Institute has just issued around the contribution of spatial planning to transport decarbonisation in different types of places and how we can address barriers to implementation. These are huge and wide-ranging issues and one that we could discuss for days, but we'll do our best in less than an hour. I'm delighted to be joined by an esteemed panel to help us along the way. I'll introduce each now, and then we'll run with short statements from our panelists based on their experience and then into questions. Please do ask questions. We'll have a question function in the software. I'll keep an eye on that throughout the session, and we'll have a Q&A once the panelists have given their statements, and we'll group some of those questions together. So turning to our panelists. First panelist is Jack Snape. Jack works at Transport for the North and has 8 years experience working as an analyst in the civil service and local government. He works in analysis and modelling right across a range of policy areas, including experience in climate change and transport. At the Committee for Climate Change, he was responsible for advising government on reducing carbon emissions from transport in the UK. His current job as analysis manager at TfN is leading the development of the analytical framework, a very powerful software tool that provides a consistent approach to data modelling and appraisal across transport modes in any regions across the north of England. Our second panellist is Philip Meikle. Philip is an advocate for sustainable transport, and he likes to say that to the extent he does not own a car, he's an advocate for sustainable transport. His career began at the front line of the rail industry, in call centres and as a guard in control rooms. Afterwards, he became involved in specifying rail franchises for central government and spent much of his career in senior roles in train operating companies. His return a few years ago to the North East was involved with a senior member of Nexus's team, looking at the future development of the public transport offer in Tyne and Wear, and that role's diversified now to become the Transport Strategy Director for Transport North East, which leads the plans and strategies for all modes across the North East of England, with a focus on enabling our economy and communities to succeed. Our third panellist, Joanna Morris, is Partnerships Manager for Sustrans in the North East of England and Cumbria. Jonah is successful in bringing organisations together to identify and work through common aims to ensure walking and cycling schemes are delivered. Jonah works with many organisations to deliver infrastructure development and behaviour change programmes, including schemes around road space reallocation, greenway schemes, the recent emergency measures, working with communities in settings such as schools, streets, delivery. And our fourth panellist who will join us a little into the presentation is James Gleave. James is a transport planner by trade, but a strategist and community engager by passion. He delivered and assisted in the delivery of many transport and infrastructure strategies and policies. He specialises in his day job at Mobility Labs in foresight, future thinking and strategy creation. James is also a member of the Transport Planning Society board, and he's been leading a project for the TPS to look at the transport planning profession's response to the pandemic, which has inspired the Society's response to the Select Committee inquiry, which has been going on. Finally, before I pass to our panelists, please do follow us on Twitter, and just to let you know, this event, like many others in the RTPI series, is being recorded and will be available shortly afterwards on the RTPI's YouTube channel. Please do bear with us with the tech. This is all new to us as we run with webinars, and we'll flip screens for speakers. So without further ado, Jack, I'd like to invite you to give your perspective on levelling up and zero carbon, using models to understand how we might achieve our objectives in the face of deep uncertainty. Over to you, Jack. Oh, Jack, sorry, I think you're on mute still.
The phrase of lockdown, sorry. So yeah, hi everyone. Transport for the North. We're a subnational transport body with a strategic planning remit that has time horizons spanning the next few decades. A lot of our work is on developing the North's long-term investment programme and wider vision for the transport network. We've always been very live to the fact that a lot is likely to change over those sorts of time frames, which is why we've always used scenario planning techniques to manage this uncertainty since the start of TFN. And the COVID crisis is having wide-ranging short-term impacts that create profound uncertainty. Some of those are already starting to trend back towards pre-crisis levels, but others could persist or even accelerate, particularly if supported by policy over a longer period of time. And I think longer-term scenarios need to consider what could plausibly happen in these areas. So scenario planning, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is a widely used technique to enable development of resilient strategies that perform well in a range of different potential futures. And when we say perform, what I really mean is assessing how these policies and interventions might help us meet our objectives. And our objectives at TFN are to create an integrated, sustainable transport network that supports inclusive growth. We started a process of refreshing our scenarios in late 2019 in consultation with our local authority partners and our wider stakeholders. And we identified a range of external factors, so things that TFN doesn't have direct influence over, that create uncertainty in the level and patterns of travel demand. And the 5 factors we considered were national economic and demographic growth, spatial planning and land use policy, national climate change action, technological change and behavioural change. Now, most national policy here is classed as external to TFN, so we need to sort of plan for different national policies that our role might be subject to. And to some extent, we class local policy as being external to the extent that local funding is also centrally controlled, and there's some uncertainty over what that will be like in the future. So taking these 5 factors together, that led us to 4 scenarios which aim to provide coherent and plausible narratives of the future of the North. And from those, we can model, using our regional land use and transport models, how schemes in our investment programme will interact with each scenario to ensure that we pick the interventions that most closely meet our objectives in these 4 diverse potential futures. They also allow us to explore the interaction between our strategy and non-TFN policies, so looking at how spatial planning, for example, might interact with regional transport policy. And that allows us to provide some additional evidence to local and national partners on how their plans might be developed to best integrate with TFN strategy. Now, the COVID crisis arrived in the midst of doing that refresh. So it was absolutely critical that we work to ensure our scenarios responded to what's happening. So we've been reviewing the long-term narratives, and all of the qualitative narratives at a high level at least were found to still be plausible. But we do need to create some additional narrative on how we get from the current situation towards that particular future. So just to give some examples, we have one scenario which is kind of highly digitized, and there's a lot of home working and use of technology for connectivity. That scenario is probably more plausible now than it was when we first conceived it in late 2019. Similarly, we have another scenario in which activity becomes more localized. There's a lot more on the local high street. People work closer to where they live. Again, that scenario probably feels more plausible now than it did before. A third scenario is around an intensification of urbanization and growth within a sort of denser city centre cores. That scenario, I think we've come to the conclusion that it's still plausible, but only in a world where we've got an effective vaccine and effective treatment for COVID, because it requires kind of relatively high density living. So we have to kind of provide a narrative about how we would get to that particular vision of the future. And I think across all 4 scenarios, we need to make some absolute adjustments. So clearly, economic growth is going to take some sort of long-term hit. The Office for Budget Responsibility has recently published some forecasts to that effect. And also home working, I think there's been a new kind of normality set to that, and we would expect home working to continue to some degree across all scenarios. And I think in terms of going forward, the crisis has really increased the importance of regularly reviewing these scenarios and refreshing them. So we need to develop a light touch way of doing this quite quickly as things evolve in the coming years. One of the things we're using these scenarios for is to develop some decarbonisation pathways. So we're looking at getting to a zero carbon transport system in the North, and we're doing this using a sort of place-based approach where we use our models to represent the geographic and socio-economic detail within the region and different approaches that might be required in different areas. These scenarios, because they're external to TFN's activity, kind of provide 4 different baselines on top of which we identify further action that's needed to meet the pathway, and who would be best placed to deliver that, whether it's national, regional or local players. And ultimately, this will lead us to a decarbonisation strategy for the North's transport system that we're going to publish towards the end of the financial year. And I think COVID has really brought to light a number of issues in decarbonisation too, that I'm sure some of the other panelists will talk about. Home working, I've already mentioned, is clearly going to have an impact on the level of carbon coming from transport. But also a really key one is public transport capacity, and how how important public transport capacity is to helping us meet our carbon goals. And if we continue to have problems getting back up to full capacity, then we're going to have to really think through carefully how we address that. And whatever happens with COVID, I think it's essential that we meet that zero carbon target. So we need to develop strategies that could be applied no matter what future we end up in, and that we can get to zero carbon regardless of what's happening externally. That's it from me. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jack. That was great and much food for thought. We'll come back with questions, but I'd like now to hand over to Philip Meikle to give the kind of regional transport response regarding reaction to the pandemic and actions around recovery as well from the northeast of England. Philip, if I can ask you to come off mute and share the webcam, that would be brilliant.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Can indeed, yeah, thank you.
And can I check I'm not upside down?
Not on mine, no.
Not on yours, good, because we were in the rehearsal. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, just to recap on who I am, I'm Philip Meikle. I'm the Transport Strategy Director of Transport North East. Andrew gave a great and helpful introduction before, and also have some responsibilities in Nexus, which is the passenger transport executive for the Tyne and Wear region here in the northeast of England. So I guess you've all seen on the news that it's challenging to work in hospitality at the moment, and that's because we're recovering from a pandemic, and because of social distancing. And suddenly everybody's beginning to realise that the balance between capacity and revenue and what that means in real life when you're running a business. And I think in the simplest possible terms, the fewer customers that you're able to fit into your pub, the fewer pints that you sell, the less money you make, and the more that your profit margin is challenged. And let me tell you that hospitality are learning this months after public transport did, because public transport was there and open on the day that social distancing came in. And what that meant on our metro system in Tyne and Wear, that we had a crush load capacity of a metro train, which would carry upwards of 500 people in the peak. And suddenly when you put social distancing into a metro train, the capacity of that train becomes 64 people. Likewise on the buses, a double-decker bus with a capacity of greater than 60 people would be reduced just to a handful. And so what social distancing, the coronavirus, has done has caused the kind of public transport commercial model to be broken. And I guess in simple terms for that is ticket sales are driven by demand and capacity, and our costs are things like staff, vehicles, and maintenance. And maintenance also is a really interesting fact where cost starts to creep in whilst revenue is down because of social distancing. Because imagine in the dead of night on a system like the metro, where people are out there maintaining the track, maintaining the overhead wires, which transmit current to the trains. They've got to work in really close proximity to one another, and so you're having to create and innovate and find new ways of delivering that. And then there's a load of other challenges which get thrown into the mix, because places like interchanges weren't designed for social distancing. Getting customers through escalators where there's a slip, trip and fall hazard 2 meters apart, and then through barriers at the top of an escalator, or getting them to spread out on a platform, is a challenge, as is loading and unloading of buses. So the way that our interchanges work and our stations, we've had to reconsider in terms of social distancing. And then the government told everybody that it was their civic duty not to use public transport, and that's not a helpful marketing message, is it? Yet at the point that people are rushing back to Wetherspoons for a socially distanced pint, they're not encouraged to travel on public transport to do so. And then government go making money available to walking and cycling, to promote walking and cycling as an active alternative to public transport, and really invest in that. So Jonah and I will be having words about that later on. But actually where the government have helped is that they've kept the emergency funding flowing for systems such as metro and other light rail across the country. And they've helped, although it has taken significant contributions from local authorities to keep the bus operators functioning as well. And actually that's really important, and we're grateful for that, because the public transport network has been about getting key workers where they need to go. They're also an iconic part of a cityscape or a rural landscape, and I think there is a bit about just trying to reinforce the message that that we will move into a future away from COVID by having familiar things around, whether it be the post office van or your local bus service. And then most importantly, there's the bit there about public transport being ready to uplift the economy and be part of the economic uplift. And we did think in terms of, oh, the day that lockdown unwinds, well, actually, lockdown did unwind very, very slowly. There wasn't a cut-off date where everybody came back and public transport patronage begins to grow. So actually, we take that as where we are now, and already I think we're beginning to get into the growth mindset of what we have to do. And public transport always does eventually reinvent itself, in my opinion. That's a personal view, not necessarily one of the people I represent. And I'm going to take you to an example from the railways, because after World War II, the commercial model for the railway system was broken. Cars began to become affordable for families. Buses were often faster, viewed as more comfortable and cleaner. And actually for freight, which was the main revenue stream of the railways many decades ago, it was found that lorries and wagons provided a more flexible alternative to shunting goods wagons around in freight yards. And as a consequence, in March 1963, a notorious report named Reshaping Britain's Railways was published, and that more commonly is known as the Beeching Report, which began to cut down the size of the UK's railways. Now, I won't say whether Beeching was a good thing or a bad thing, because there's an argument before and against that, and certainly do not want that to happen now. But railways did reinvent themselves, and almost 50 years later, the government launched Reshaping Your Railways Fund, also known as the Beeching Reversal Fund. Now, we don't have 50 years to reinvent ourselves this time. That cannot happen. So what did we do in 50 days? Well, actually, in the northeast of England, we really began to tune into our customer focus panels really quickly and do the research to find out what customers wanted. And the kind of hierarchy of needs of customers very quickly changed to make sure that cleanliness featured. It always has featured, but it began to become right in the bottom, in the foundations of that architecture. So very actively, we found solutions which, for example, can spray to put virus-resistant coatings on surfaces in metro cars. We've used social media to reassure customers about that, and things that have been easy to deliver, such as hand sanitizers on stations, as you see in shops we rolled out at a lot of locations. And we began to understand, get the capacity in for social distancing as soon as we could, which means we did, in fact, in Metro's case, operate more trains than we needed to, so that there was the capacity to welcome people back on board. And there still is capacity in the public transport network now. So already the commercial bus operators and light rail began to really tune into what the customer needs are, so that people can feel confident and welcome back. And I know that our mainline railway colleagues have done that as well. So I think finally now we need to reflect on how we adjust for the long term in our region. And I think, Jack, some of the scenarios that you just went through there, it was interesting to say that there were things that you put out there and now you see them as plausible scenarios, and actually there's some of the things which are on my mind as well now as we begin to strategize and get delivery right for the future. So I think the first thing that public transport has got to do, it's really got to begin to harmonise with our country's digital offer. And that means getting ready to think about where and when people may wish to travel will differ. So it could be about ironing out the peaks as home working begins to take over, and actually spread the service, a better service across the day, so that public transport is always seen as being there and there's no better time to travel with better frequencies. I think we're also learning that actually the public transport network may become nodally polycentric, more so than having central nodes, perhaps in city centres, which people gravitate towards. Perhaps if you've got two home working colleagues who are living on separate sides of a city, they might not choose to meet in the centre. If they did want to go for coffee somewhere, they might choose to go and get their quirky hipster cappuccino in one of the suburbs. I think now's the time for public transport to really adjust and examine its relationship with the car. Now, car has a place, especially in a region like this, which has a very rural footprint when you think about areas of Northumberland and County Durham. But in a new emerging economy, what can public transport do? Well, actually, there is somebody I know who, from the Chamber of Commerce, who would argue that that cars don't always help a region's economy because they take spend out of it in terms of payments like car insurance, in terms of fuel. Although please do buy Nissans which are manufactured in the North East. But the chances are, as home working comes in, people might question their own relationship with the car as they spend more on something which they use less, and that means it's time for kind of public transport to step in there. And then I think there's a bit that public transport has to do to redefine its place within a region, and that's absolutely alongside active travel, because active travel and public transport really should absolutely be working harmoniously. And I think for me, that's a big piece about quality of life, placemaking and communities, and beginning to mould the end-to-end customer-centric journey together in a more integrated way than we do in the UK. And I think that's important for a region like the North East, because as companies begin to re-examine their financial footprint post-COVID, they might consider relocating to a place such as ours, where house prices are cheaper, where the scenery is beautiful, where the air is fresh, and the people are really good company. And so to do that, we really need to sell place, and public transport combined with active travel as part of that offer for leisure, never mind work, is absolutely essential. So I think, to sum up, what can you do as planners? Well, do what you've always done and really think about the integration of public transport in places, in the places that you design and conceptualize. And I think do it from a customer-centric way. Do it now to think the mind of the user and the individual, and sometimes do it bottom up and take the steps through that journey to make it something that you'd really like to experience. And that's it from me, Andrew. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Philip. Loads to think about there in terms of practical actions that we can take, and we'll come back to some of those in the questions if we may. Just a quick reminder, we do have this question function in the software. If anybody thinks of something as we're going through the speaker's statements, then please do record it down. We'll keep an eye on those, and we'll ask those at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jonah. Jonah is going to take us through some of the active travel elements of this, and maybe challenge what Philip's just said about public transport versus the car versus active travel, or how can we work together, and also about the boom and in terms of kind of use of active travel that we've experienced during the pandemic, and how do we avoid that fizzling out. So over to you, Jonah.
Thank you, Andrew. Just in response to Philip, the beaching cut a lot of local rail networks, but it did provide the backbone for the national cycle network that mainly uses old beaching lines. So in response to the UK government's announcement of a £2 billion package of investment for active travel, cities and towns across the UK are set to see a flurry of long-awaited activity to make walking and cycling safer. Of course, at Sustrans, we're excited to see this prioritisation of people walking and cycling for their everyday journeys. But you only have to take a brief look at the comment sections of local press articles to see quite clearly that not everyone is convinced. The Secretary of State, Grant Shapps, stated that making streets safe for walking and cycling is good for retailers, business and the economy. But there are many who are less sure. So as they question the economic benefits of reducing motor vehicles in our city and town centres. So what does the evidence tell us about how investing in active travel impacts the local economy? Let's start with the age-old myth. Closing streets to cars will harm the local economy. Evidence abounds showing that, in fact, pedestrianisation generally has a more positive or neutral effect economically. What if I were to tell you that shop vacancy rates are 5 times higher on streets with high levels of traffic, or that retail turnover in pedestrianised areas generally outperforms non-pedestrian areas? Both of these statements are true. And then there's the assumption that removing car parking spaces will harm the local economy. Again, it turns out the opposite is in fact true. For starters, retailers tend to significantly overestimate how many of their customers travel by car, and hence overestimate the number of parking spaces their customers require. And by significantly overestimate, I mean by a factor of 100%. Furthermore, evidence shows us that per square metre, cycle parking delivers 5 times higher retail spend than the same area of car parking. While those who arrive on a shopping street in a car may spend more in a one go, people who access the cycle parking space that would be taken up by just one car spend more in repeat visits. Finally, there is the misconception that cycle infrastructure is expensive. Well, with the advent of pop-up cycle lanes in cities across the world, we can see that cycle infrastructure does not have to be expensive. And of course, we've got pop-up cycle lanes appearing across the region and across the UK as part of the Emergency Active Travel Fund. But what about when we're talking about building the high specification cycle lanes that Sustrans advocates for, not just those created using cones or white paint on the road? Here again, the evidence disproves the myth. High quality cycle schemes cost around 1.3 million per kilometre. This compares to around 50 million per kilometre for road schemes. So improvements to cycle and walking infrastructure involve low capital outlay compared to other types of transport scheme improvements. And the maintenance costs of cycling or walking infrastructure are significantly lower too, making them much better value for money. What does all this mean in the current situation? Right now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we want to ensure that those who are unable to use public transport due to physically distancing requirements don't just jump back in their cars. If they do, we will see a return of the congestion and toxic levels of air pollution our cities have been experiencing pre-lockdown. At the same time, we want our local businesses to be able to recover from the impact of the national lockdown. We want them not just to survive, but thrive, to use the government's terminology. With all the evidence showing the positive impacts of closing streets to cars or removing car parking spaces can have on local retailers, we should do everything we can to support our local authorities to be bold and make these changes. Making it possible for more people to get to their local high streets as lockdown eases is not just a nice to have. It will be key to our adaptation and economic recovery from COVID-19. I'd like to briefly cover some of the biggest myths to cycling and how they can be busted. This came from a piece of work we carried out on behalf of DFT as part of the Elsewhere programme. So myth 1, there is no public support for cycling for investment in cycle infrastructure. So 75% of people would like to see more money spent on cycling in their city. The types of infrastructure people find most useful are segregated on-road tracks and traffic-free cycling routes. And no study shows that there is the opposite to be found in terms of public support. So myth 2, road space reallocation to bicycles will bring the city to a grinding halt. A 3-metre wide lane can move 700 to 1,100 people per hour in cars, whereas for bicycles and walking, this increases to 2,000 to 6,500. 2 weeks after opening, the cycle superhighway corridors in London were moving 5% more people per hour than they could without the cycle lanes. So myth 3, removing cycle parking will harm the local economy. As I've already mentioned, retailers overestimate how many of their customers travel by car by a factor of 100%. Converting car parking spaces to seating and planting to improve place impact can contribute to regeneration and improvements in retail performance. Removal of car parking spaces from a shopping street in Seattle was followed by a 400% increase in retail sales. Myth 4, closing streets to cars will harm the local economy. So as I've already mentioned, you've got the overestimating travel by car by 100%. Shop vacancy rates are 5 times higher on streets with high levels of traffic. Myth 5, our streets are too narrow to accommodate separated cycle infrastructure. Design decisions should reflect the characteristics of particular streets. Many streets can accommodate high quality cycling infrastructure by removing car parking or making streets one-way to motorised traffic. On narrow streets, reducing traffic volume and speed can also mean no special infrastructure is required. Myth 6, cycling is not safe. The safety of cycling is determined by the conditions in which people have to cycle. Most cycle casualties, 77%, occur on 30-mile-an-hour roads, which is a strong argument for reducing traffic speeds where people want to cycle. Cycling is not inherently unsafe. This is demonstrated by the difference in fatality and injury rates between Denmark, where 17% of all trips are made by bicycle, and 9 out of 10 Danes own a bicycle, and the UK. Denmark's cyclist fatality rate is half that of Great Britain. High quality cycle infrastructure is vital to reduce road dangers for people cycling and improve the perception of safety to attract more people and types of people to cycle. Myth 7, investing in road building always makes the most economic sense. There are published ex post evaluations of active travel schemes that show better value for money than road schemes. Road projects produce returns of £3 to £5 for every £1 spent, whereas walking and cycling schemes produce returns of £4 to £19 for every £1 spent. Myth 8, people don't support road space reallocation to bicycles. As we found in our bike life study, 78% of residents in UK cities support building more protected roadside cycle lanes, even when this could mean less space for other road traffic. And finally, myth 9, cycle infrastructure is expensive. So as I've already mentioned, high specification cycle schemes cost 1.3 million per kilometre on average. Road schemes cost around £50 million per kilometre. The HS2 rail scheme is predicted to cost £77 million per kilometre. As well as relatively low capital outlay compared to other types of transport investment, cycling and walking schemes have high benefit to cost ratios, making them value for money. And finally, in summary, there is an abundance of evidence out there, we just need to use it. As Philip mentioned, we can't expect public transport to return to pre-COVID levels, so what are the alternatives? We know that most trips are under 5 miles, and the key is to convert these and the significant increase we've seen in terms of leisure cycling during lockdown to utility cycling, shopping, commuting done by bike. And for that, we need safe, segregated infrastructure.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Joanna. That's so much there for thought. We're still waiting for our final speaker, James Gleave, to join. So I think we'll bring all panelists in if we may, and we'll start with some questions. When James joins, we can dive into his thoughts as well. I'd like to pick up actually first on something that Jack you said in your presentation about flexible policies and the challenge about meeting the kind of carbon goals. Do you think there's a need for kind of more checks and balances in transport policy more generally in terms of how we deal with decarbonisation through our strategy making and our delivery more generally? For example, you know, we can kind of create a transport policy, a plan, and then, you know, does anyone really scrutinise that? I suppose we're seeing it a bit more by kind of, you know, action groups, you know, particularly in the work with the likes of the RIS2, for example. But, you know, is there a need for more of that to happen at a sort of a government level, if you like, about what's actually happening on the ground and how they contribute towards decarbonisation, those projects being delivered?
Yeah, I suppose two things that immediately spring to mind. I think one is in the economic appraisal process for kind of deciding which schemes to build, there is a need quite urgently to look again at the carbon values that are used within that. They're quite old now. I think they've not been updated for over 10 years or something, and they're not consistent with the targets in the Paris Agreement. So I know the central government is looking at that, and that needs to be done fairly urgently, or very urgently, really. And that will start to have an impact on, you know, what decisions are made, and start to sort of more of a push towards schemes that are needed for for getting to a zero carbon transport network. The other point is something that TfN is really pushing for in things like the review of the Treasury's Green Book, is looking at things at a programme level. So not necessarily just looking at kind of marginal policy by policy decisions, but how does this network, this individual scheme fit into the vision for the network overall, for the programme overall. So having a bigger push for appraisal of programmes at a city, region or a regional level, to show how the development of the transport network will meet the overall kind of targets that are set out. Because individual policies, you know, hopefully the majority of them will help to reduce emissions, but what matters is what the sum of the parts and how they all fit together, particularly as the transport network is a system and people use it in kind of joined up ways. You know, people switch modes, and people use cycling to access railway stations, for example. So it's very important to look at it programmatically.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks. I totally agree with that. Yeah, brilliant. Philip, one for you, if I may. That's come through the question function here, is around about access to opportunities for people, particularly those that sort of graduating. And this was actually in a pre-COVID scenario this question, but the universities have done a bit of work a while ago, but essentially looking at it takes as long to travel between Sunderland and Durham on more congested days than it does to go from Durham to London by train, and longer at holidays such as Christmas. And that obviously can inhibit opportunities for kind of people to kind of stay here and retain student talent in the jobs market. So really about you know, do we feel that, and how do we ensure that we can provide the certainty to students that, you know, those issues are going to be addressed, I suppose, in the future, and dealing with those transport inconveniences largely.
So the answer is yes. That's an acknowledged challenge for our region. Now, does that stand for a graduate in the post-COVID world? I know the question was pre-COVID. Who knows? Because actually some sectors will make the digital transition more quickly than others, and it may be that a balanced digital and transport solution becomes right. For example, in the knowledge sector economy. The issue still stands though, because there'll be people who perhaps aren't graduating or who may be out of work as a consequence of furlough, and we will need to quickly address changes in needs to our region's skill set, and that might mean people travelling to training, it might mean people travelling to apprenticeships, and it might mean that they have to do that with very little money in their pocket. So to get people to opportunity, we now more than ever need to be looking at cost-effective public transport solutions which link places like Sunderland to Durham really effectively, because now more than ever that can be the lifeline to get people back into work, to get them to a new job opportunity, or to get them to training that they need. So I think to sum that answer up, some people may be able to migrate to a digital solution in a challenge like that, but we know that there are others who just won't, and that's why those transport links are about to become more essential than they ever were.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. It's much appreciated. Jonah, you sort of did a fantastic job in sort of busting some of those myths there around active travel investment, cycle investment there. How do we deal, do you think, with the sort of the wider public sort of behaviour elements around particularly climate and weather and winterisation, if you like, and maintaining those levels of activity throughout those, which often we see demand fall, don't we? So is there anything we can do there for our work?
Well, if you look across the North Sea to kind of what a lot of people consider best practice, you know, they have the same climate as we do, and they still cycle. There's certainly a job on local authorities' behalf to make sure that any separated infrastructure is cleaned in the winter. You know, people slipping on ice because a cycle path hasn't been cleared. That's not going to kind of convert those that we need to convert into cycling. There's also a significant job in terms of the boom that we've seen during lockdown of people using cycling for leisure and trying to convert those trips to utility cycling kind of whilst the weather's good. Get them locked into a cycling culture just to make those trips that are under a mile or under 2 miles walked or cycled, and hopefully that then can continue during the winter months.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's a really good point around maintenance, and particularly of that infrastructure as we go. So I suppose one of the questions is about resource to be able to plan differently into recovery phase. You know, government obviously have funded emergency measures to date. They've started talking around different models for public transport funding going forward as it sort of recovers in terms of demand. Do you think we'll get kind of resource through leadership policies and powers and funding ultimately to kind of lead us towards this decarbonised future? Is the transport decarbonisation plan, for example, the kind of opportunity for kind of colleagues to really kind of lobby government to really think differently in terms of how they allocate funds for investment in public and sustainable transport? So I think I'll probably take an answer from all three of you, if I may. So Philip, if we can take a response from you, that would be great first.
Yeah, I mean, we need funding because public transport has to be sustainable for the long term. Now some of that might be changes to powers and how we do things as well. Because what's really important is if you take something like public transport fares, getting them pertinent to what the people in your region can afford. One of the long-standing arguments for rail evolution to our region is that on our local rail services across the North East, actually they're planned in York and Manchester, and fares are set in York and Manchester, and so actually there's no relationship or understanding between the people taking the decisions and the kind of needs of the end user. Where does this need to go? Well, what would really help is devolve funding pipelines, because if I look at transport as a whole, there are road schemes which are needed in this region as an immediate fix to some economic I beg your pardon, some environmental needs, just to clean up junctions, actually, because you can't make the move overnight to completely to a non-car dependent society, and actually some parts of our region are a very long way away from that because of their rural nature. But what we can do is we can clean up car journeys, and we can redesign the likes of junctions so that they are better for people on bikes, people who are walking around. We do need the active travel infrastructure in, actually. So for the record, it was a joke before about public transport and active travel kind of abstracting from public transport. We need those schemes in there, and that's part of a capital infrastructure pipeline, which should cover road interventions where they're needed. It should cover active travel, and it should cover enhancements to metro and local rail network. So yes, we do need funding, and we need surety of funding in both revenue terms, i.e. OPEX terms, to keep the buses and the metros moving, and for capital so that we can invest in any mode of transport to build great new infrastructure and actually design it in a great way as well. As Jonah was talking about planting and stuff like that, we've got to get it right, but for that we need surety of funding.
Great, thank you. And Jack, from your perspective, TFN have been calling for a kind of northern infrastructure pipeline and devolved funding settlement. So do you share that sentiment as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So you know, we've been making the case for that for quite a long time now, and I think a key point to make is that we're looking for something that's additional to what's needed at a local level for city regions, for other local authorities. So, you know, the regional transport network has gone through decades of underinvestment, but that shouldn't be investing in those schemes shouldn't be a replacement for what's needed at a local level for active travel, for bus, for local rail and tram and so on. To have an integrated transport network where people can access the regional rail infrastructure, you absolutely have to have those well-functioning access modes. I think the way we're looking to sort of, if we can make the case for this pipeline, we're looking to appraise schemes against a new Northern Transport Charter, which has the objectives of the Strategic Transport Plan at its heart, and we'll look to prioritise schemes that meet the objectives of being kind of environmentally sustainable and socially inclusive. So there'll be a kind of well-rounded appraisal framework used to prioritise that investment.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, it's fantastic. And Jonah, do you have any thoughts on that about, you know, how do we lobby for, you know, further investment in active travel, basically beyond existing pipelines of funding?
Well, it was really welcome to see the foreword by Grant Chaps in terms of the decarbonisation strategy, talking about active travel kind of being here for the future, in terms of how we deal with decarbonising transport as a whole. We know the funding started through DFT. Tranche 2 bids have got to be in by August 7th. It's really welcome to see DFT pushing boldness and reallocation of road space. In the future, you know, we're looking to alignment with LSWIP prioritisation plans that local authorities have done, so making sure those key corridors work for everyone. And for a department that's not necessarily known for its speed at times, it's really welcome to see that speed coming from central government. We saw the shift in Wuhan in terms of kind of initial results of a shift from public transport pre-lockdown to private car use post-lockdown, and you know, we know what we want to avoid here. But kind of touching on what Philip said, I think for a region we want to see devolution of transport powers and spend, kind of whatever the geography of the region that needs to happen within. But the other thing is the use of behaviour change kind of in tandem with safe segregated infrastructure. So you're giving people the space, but you're also giving them that behaviour change in order so that they can make that shift permanent.
Great, yeah, thank you. We just got another question through the chat, a couple of questions through the chat function, which I'll take now. So a key question: with our lack of urban road space, will COVID reduce our flattened peak period demand? And Philip, I think you sort of alluded to this in what you were saying in your statement there, to allow more sort of effective public transport and active travel. So kind of almost spreading the demand across the day. So, you know, does the offer need to change according to that?
Yeah. So I didn't go into the stats when I spoke, but we were in a position where on the roads network in the North East, and these won't be accurate because they're me relaying them, but so take these as kind of broad examples. We had a situation where in what you would call traditionally the morning peak, kind of 7:30 or 9 in the morning, road traffic was down by about 70%, and it still is depressed now. I mean, if go and take a look at the end of your own street in what would be the peak. The roads are quieter, people aren't driving to work, and it's suppressed by school drop-off. And actually, I hope people see the benefits of active travel now more than ever on school drop-off, because suppressing traffic in the morning peak is just is great for the school kids. Road traffic builds towards lunchtime to get to near normal levels. That's not quite happened on public transport yet, but we kind of see a kind of peak now in the middle of the day of people traveling around. So it has all changed, and will that remain the same? Well, let's find out. But I think it's home working which is driving that. And if that's the case, we need to be ready to reimagine our public transport service, and also road traffic design for motor vehicles around completely different demands at different times of day. It changes the business case, and we've got to be open-minded to that to succeed.
Great, thank you. And just in that kind of finding out, do you think September will be a big sort of change, I suppose, with the schools going back, or pupils going back, as government is currently saying, you know, to kind of how people do use the road network? I suppose, is that going to be the big test for us?
Will it be a test? Well, we wouldn't be doing anything that we haven't done in the past, either on public transport and the road network, because if September did take us back to what we were familiar with, then actually it's what we're set up to do. I think the challenge is Jonah ready for it? Because it's been great to see everybody out walking, cycling in the first few days of lockdown, especially amongst young people. So they fall into the habit of doing it for a lifetime because it's great. So I think that I think my challenge is to Jonah and Sustrans. Are you ready to promote a new way of life come September?
Jonah, would you like to respond to that?
Certainly. I mean, yeah, it's why we're here. I mean, just on the point of demand, you know, if we did see a return to congestion levels kind of pre-COVID, you know, just remember cycle journeys don't change. You know, it might take you half an hour to drive from the coast into Newcastle, and you know that'll change up and down by 10-15 minutes per day, but it will consistently take you the same amount of time to cycle. We've seen depressed levels of road traffic, but we've seen increases of kind of 300% on cycle counters across the region, and that's consistently kind of carrying through. In terms of a scheme that we were involved in North Tyneside around road space reallocation, you know, we've seen a 700% increase in the number of cyclists there. You know, 1,000 people using it daily, up to 1,500 using it over the weekend. So we know the demand is there, and it just proves that kind of that point again, that safe, separated infrastructure away from traffic is what is going to encourage people that don't currently cycle to, you know, get the bike out of the shed. Hopefully with the government's voucher scheme coming online very soon, they'll be able to make sure that that bike is safe, and then they can start to make that modal shift.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely. I think I totally agree with that. There's one final question, because I'm conscious of time. We're running up to 12 o'clock, and now James hasn't been able to join us, unfortunately. But just around accessibility in terms of kind of design of particularly active travel schemes, I think this question's alluding to. You know, is there any sort of best practice guidance that you can point colleagues towards in terms of building in these schemes to make sure that they don't exclude those who kind of require level access, step access, you know, etc. Throughout the built environment, I suppose, is the question there. Tactile things like that. Is there anything you could point towards, Jonah, on that question?
We're still awaiting new government guidance, which should be out soon, hopefully. We do have a suite of documents on the Sustrans website that kind of points to best practice guidance at the moment, so hopefully people can take advantage of that.
Perfect, that's great. Send links around. That's great. Well, we've reached 12 o'clock. I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time out of their busy diaries to take part today. Virtual fist pumps or elbow bumps or whatever we're allowed to do these days. And thank you also to Kim for organising this and running the tech behind the scenes. Yeah, we'll be sending around obviously the link and some feedback as well. If you could fill that out, that would be great. So the link to the video, I should say. And please do keep an eye out for future events that we've got in the calendar. And I think the beauty of this with virtual working is that there's loads of virtual online events that are in the RTPI's calendar as well. So not just ones that are organised by us as the North East, but ones from every region across the country. So yeah, that's great. And also the results of the RTPI's research into place-based solutions as well. It'll be really interesting to see the findings from that, which will be coming out later this year. So without further ado, thank you very much everybody for your time, and thanks for joining us. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.